His actions were reported to the Tlaxcalan Council, who notified Cortes that he was stirring up rebellion and that such actions warranted the death penalty under their laws. Cortes then had no choice but to deal sternly with him. For if he were to return to Tlaxcala, he would not be treated kindly. Still, Cortes offered him yet another chance, promising the headstrong young man that he'd be treated fairly if he complied. But the Tlaxcalan refused, and when Cortes sent the guard to forcibly bring him, he fought back and was tragically killed by multiple wounds. It marked the sad end of a man who in different times might have become a figure comparable to Hannibal or Caesar. The journey had a 15-mile haul ahead, and the route was mainly through a challenging, mountainous area. Sizable groups of Mexican soldiers often showed up, but upon seeing the Spaniards were always combat-ready, they backed off. Eventually, Sandoval, after a particularly tough trek, was lucky enough to get to Texcoco unscathed, where he was warmly welcomed by Cortes. As they busied themselves with the shipbuilding, another lucky circumstance unfolded. Cortes had, some time ago, dispatched some of his officers to Hispaniola to get him back up if they could. He'd been eagerly wanting their return and had waited for so long with no luck, but finally came the exciting news that 4 ships carrying sizable reinforcements had landed at Vera Cruz from Hispaniola. They brought 200 soldiers, 80 horses, 2 large guns, and loads of powder and rounds. The shipbuilding process was then stepped up with utmost enthusiasm. Even though the Mexicans tried to obstruct the work and burn the ships while still on the slipways, their plans were thwarted by Cortes's vigilance and his soldiers' bravery. Eventually, the ships were completed and launched, and as the wind filled their sails, a joyous cheer went up, signaling the pivotal event to the entire surrounding area. Cortes decided to strike the city from 3 different directions and split his forces into 3 groups. Sandoval was put in charge of the first group, Alvarado the second, and Olid the third. The first group was set to move forward from Texcoco, the second from Tacuba, and the third from Cajahuacan. Meanwhile, Cortes himself, heading the ships, was ready to back them up. The 3 of them positioned themselves and began moving. During their progress, Alvarado and Olid demolished the impressive aqueducts that channeled the fresh mountain water from many miles distant to the island city. The resulting water shortage was just the beginning of the numerous trials the people had to face. From that moment forward, not a day went by without a severe skirmish. The ships had to fend off a large swarm of small canoes, and the ground forces had to handle a similar swarm of enemies at the causeways. The flimsy canoes were quickly destroyed or forced ashore, but progress was minimal in the encounters at the causeways. The Spanish forces vigorously attacked the barriers built to guard the openings, but they were compelled to retreat to the mainland every night. Meanwhile, every night, the city's defenders repaired the damage they had incurred during the day. Despite all the violence, they made no headways, and the exhaustion experienced by the Spanish forces and their allies grew so intense that there was a growing fear they would slowly be worn down. Chapter 15. Massive loss for Spaniards. In battle, prisoners face doom. Some of Cortes' allies back out, but quickly return. Mexico City seized. Guatemozin tries to escape, but is captured. Cortes, recognizing that the battle couldn't proceed in its current state, chose to wrap up the drawn-out, exhausting conflict with one audacious move. He planned for a widespread attack at a specified time, around the end of May 1521, instructing each of his commanders to charge into the city with their units, despite every adversity, and establish a foothold there. He personally led the attack on the causeway of Cajahuacan, determined that no obstacle would prevent him from breaching the city. The momentous day arrived. The leaders positioned themselves at the forefront of their troops, and the catastrophe began. It was a gripping spectacle. The relentless advance of the Spaniards met with the obstinate defense of the Mexicans. Cortes was unstoppable. He sequestered each barricade in desperate onslaughts, knocked down or gunned down everything in his path, and chased the fleeing enemy into the city. Guatemozin, who had been kept updated with every development, was overjoyed at the recklessness of the enemy as he realized it played to his advantage. He quickly ordered significant brigades to diverge by various meandering paths to the deserted causeways, widen the gaps as much as possible, and maintain their positions there. The rest of his warriors, currently embroiled in close combat with the enemy, slowly retreated with the goal of drawing the excited Spaniards deeper into the city. His sly plan worked. Assuming his commands to be accomplished, Cortes, without a second thought, expelled the enemy from one street to the next, and finally arrived at the very location where Guatemozin lay in wait with his top-tier fighters. All of a sudden, following a cue from the emperor, the imposing boom of the war deity's ceremonial drum radiated from the nearby temple, a noise that inevitably aroused indescribable fury and fearless scorn for death in every Mexican's heart. Before they knew what hit them, the bewildered Spaniards were besieged from all angles, so vehemently that despite all their bravery and prowess, they couldn't hold off the assault. Incrementally, they began retreating while tightly huddled and on the defensive, but as the swarm of their enemies swelled and their onslaught intensified, they slowly started to resort to escape for survival. Semblance of their formation eventually dispersed. Spaniards and Tlaxcalans, infantry and cavalry alike, scrambled chaotically to the nearest causeway, where their fear amplified upon discovering the enemy controlled it. Despite Cortes's desperate attempts with orders and pleas to rein in the chaotic escape and re-establish structure, they were to no avail. They registered nothing, heard nothing. Their sole drive was self-preservation by any means necessary. They plunged into the openings in groups. Many succumbed to the watery depths, while others were apprehended or slaughtered by the enemies in canoes, as unluckily, that part of the lake was too shallow for Spanish vessel assistance. Highly distressed by his troops' jeopardy, but undeterred for his personal welfare, Cortes scrambled to pull some from the water and others from enemy grasp, only to be forcefully grabbed by 6 sturdy Mexican chiefs and hauled away victoriously. Witnessing the situation, 2 of his officers decided to rescue their commander by forfeiting their lives. They lunged into the enemy lines, struggled and succumbed, but not before eliminating those who were detaining Cortes. He escaped, grievously disfigured, at the expense of his officers' lives, which hurt him more than his own injuries. Over 1,000 Tlaxcalans and more than 60 Spaniards fell on the battlefield. Numerous were seized, and among those who managed to escape, almost every single one was wounded in some manner. Cortes found himself in a dire situation. His troops were utterly demoralized, and the adversary was just as invigorated. They had gained such confidence that by the following morning they dared to attack headquarters, which Cortes and his allies struggled to fend off. At this point, Guatemozin had a deceptive strategy in mind to outsmart his foe. He paraded the severed heads of the fallen Spaniards throughout the provinces, while announcing far and wide that the spilt blood of these opponents had placated the war god. He further declared that within 8 days, all the despised outsiders would be eliminated. This news struck fear into Cortes's native allies. Their superstition was so overwhelming, they believed without hesitation the war god's decree would come to pass. They decided to cut all ties with the people they believed were doomed by the divine. Some of the Tlaxcalans started to defect. However, Cortes came up with a scheme to forestall this withdrawal that proved effective. He ceased all attacks for 8 days, shielded his deeply entrenched army with his ships, and simply waited out the countdown for his alleged downfall. When the time passed without the Spaniards suffering any harm, the allies began to see the truth. They recognized they had been fooled, felt embarrassed about their naivety, and were more committed than before to aid the Spaniards in the complete defeat of the detested Mexican Empire. Likewise, those who had doubted the deceitful war god proclamation were even more thankful that the trickery had foolproofed the collapse of the Mexicans. So many old and new supporters flocked to their side that within a few days Cortes commanded an army of 150,000 locals, yet, despite the incredible boost in his forces, he took things more cautiously than ever. He extended peace offerings to the Mexicans multiple times, but Guatemozin, thoroughly saw that any pact with the Spaniards would subject himself and his people to subjugation, boldly rebuffed the propositions, remaining resolute to either liberate his homeland or perish trying. Conflict resumed. The city was now completely blockaded. As a result, it was impossible to bring in any supplies. This led to a severe shortage of food, followed, as usual, by a sweeping disease, which led to the death of the indigenous people in large numbers. All the while, the Spanish forces were slowly progressing towards the city along the three bridges. As part of Cortes's new strategy, every move forward was accompanied by plans for a hasty withdrawal to the mainland if necessary. By maintaining this approach, the city was finally accessible from all three sides, forcing the courageous Guatemozin to fight the Spanish forces on a mere strip of land. The latter kept moving forward, setting aflame the parts of the city they conquered and reinforcing their well-fortified position. Their main target was the city's large marketplace, and Alvarado reached it first. Cortes quickly followed, leading Olid's division and pushing the Mexicans back with force. Sandoval also joined them, leading to severe bloodshed. Now, 3/4 of the city were under Spanish control and nearly burned to ground. Guatemozin had fortified himself in the remaining part, with his best fighters prepared for the Spaniards' forthcoming attack. Despite this, Cortes, who sought to avoid further bloodshed and was confident that Guatemozin's resistance was nearly at its end, halted further conflict and proposed a peace deal. It looked as though the emperor was ready to agree, and there was a short lull in the fighting with no formal agreement. Both sides faced each other, with only a trench separating them. Total silence prevailed. All the while, Guatemozin kept delaying the Spaniards, promising to personally lead negotiations. This was merely a ploy to catch the Spaniards off guard and hide his actual intentions. At the urging of his nobility, he decided to escape capture or death by fleeing to a remote province of his empire, where he planned to raise a new army and resist his foes. All necessary arrangements were made. The Mexican nobles were ready to sacrifice their lives for their cherished emperor. They had a significant number of boats prepared and tried to stage a surprise attack on the Spanish fleet as Guatemozin was being transported across the lake. Despite Sandoval's fruitless attempts at driving them back with heavy artillery, they showed no fear of death or injury and kept attempting to engage the enemies in a direct fight. Suddenly, Sandoval spotted a full-strength canoe rowing rapidly across the lake. He also noticed what the canoe was carrying and immediately started a chase. Holguin, with the fastest vessel, got to it first, but upon realizing he was ready to attack, the rowers ceased paddling and pleaded for the emperor's life. Overjoyed by his lucky break, Holguin jumped into the canoe, sword in hand. Guatemozin received him bravely and fearlessly, acknowledged he was his captive, and was prepared to go with him, only requesting that his wife and her maid receive decent treatment. He reassured the latter, offered a few words of encouragement, and then offered his hand to lead them to the vessel. That moment, it was August 13th, 1521, sealed the fate of the entire Mexican Empire, whose emperor was handed over to the Spanish. Holguin quickly led his captive to Cortes, who greeted him at the lakeshore with the reverence warranted by his status and character. The unfortunate Guatemozin seemingly accepted the kindness of his victor with a certain satisfaction, and accompanied him with great composure to his living quarters. He sat for a moment, then stood and said to Cortes, with the aid of a translator, "I've done what was required of me. I no longer matter, and a captive like me must be a nuisance to his captor. Go ahead. Take this dagger, handing it over to Cortes, and drive it into my heart, ending my pointless life." Hearing these words, his wife broke down crying, and Cortes was deeply moved. He urged the unfortunate man to get a hold of himself, then left in order to avoid exacerbating their distress by his presence. The moment it was confirmed that Guatemozin was seized, the Mexicans surrendered, and the Spanish took control of the city. The initial days were marked by celebration over the successful outcome of their mission. But this soon turned to frustration, due to the underwhelming reward they were set to receive after facing so many risks and hardships. Most of the houses had been destroyed, including their wealth, and when Guatemozin realized that his capital's security was uncertain, all valuable items from the royal treasury had been dumped in the lake. The collected loot was so insignificant that numerous Spanish soldiers disdainfully tossed aside their allocated share. They quickly began to publicly condemn Guatemozin, and then their general, accusing him of hoarding the majority of the treasure. Cortes struggled to calm them down to no avail. Alderete, who had been named royal treasurer, sided with the complainers, insisting, due to his position, the emperor and his prime minister should be handed over to him to reveal where in the lake the wealth had been hidden. This time, Cortes, who had weathered many adversities, shockingly and callously gave in to this demand. Guatemozin and his committed prime minister were subjected to extreme torture. Guatemozin faced all the brutalities designed with incredible resilience. The prime minister followed his lead, but when they prepared to torment him further, he let out a loud scream and glanced at his ruler as if seeking permission to disclose what he knew. Guatemozin interpreted the look and calmly responded, "Am I resting on a bed of roses?" His words moved his devoted servant deeply. He no longer made a sound as he died bravely before his tormented ruler, demonstrating the grand fortitude of a hero and the tranquility of a saint. Cortes, having picked up on the distressed pleas of the unfortunate individual from afar, was suddenly overwhelmed with guilt and embarrassment. He urgently made his way to the room and saved the life of the tormented emperor. Chapter 16. Tapia, assigned to Cortes, is persuaded to head back to Cuba. Cortes is ratified as governor of New Spain. He travels to Spain and is knighted. A second trip to Spain reveals the court's inconstancy. He pleads in vain for the emperor's favor, his death. The acquisition of royal territories quickly ensued after the city's seizure. They each surrendered subsequently, and their inhabitants bore the same brutal fate as the American island dwellers had experienced for 2 decades. They were enslaved and harshly treated. Amid this, Cortes did not hear back from Spain and was unsure about the perception of his activities back home. Eventually, a ship docked at Vera Cruz, with a man named Tapia on board, who was dispatched to unseat Cortes, bring him to court, and take over his role. Luckily for Cortes, this man was both feeble and gutless. He cleverly put up plenty of barriers and intimidated him in numerous ways, so much so that Tapia concluded the best bet for him was to head back without even attempting to accomplish his task. Cortes also knew that he was a highly greedy man and offered to buy his horses, slaves, and his entire arrangement, in all, at a decent price. Tapia agreed to the offer and journeyed back to Cuba with a considerable sum of gold. The storm hanging over Cortes's head, however, began to brew once more. To dodge it, he sent additional messengers to Spain to submit a detailed account of his actions to the Emperor, Charles V, and present him with his portion of the spoils. The stunning nature of his achievements and the significance of his conquest both delighted and astonished the young ruler. He not only endorsed all that Cortes had done, but promoted him to the role of governor of New Spain, and assigned a team to explore the claims of Velázquez. Predictably, this team made their report align with their superior's desires. Velázquez's allegations of Cortes's disloyalty and his pretenses of ruling over the newly won territory were dismissed as baseless, and he was deemed eligible to no further reimbursement than the legitimate expenses of the expedition. This double humiliation was more than the proud and fiery Velázquez could bear. It claimed his life, and Cortes now found himself at the very apex of fortune. He started to rebuild Mexico from its ashes and strengthen Spanish hold over the empire. In realizing his plans, he adopted the most ruthless and autocratic strategies, which provoked another rebellion from the Mexicans. This insurrection was promptly quashed, however, and savage punishments were meted out to leaders and nobles. Upon merely hearing a rumor that Guatemozin had incited the Mexicans, this courageous, unselfish prince and also the leaders of Texcoco and Tacuba, were hanged. Some Spanish officials who had been dispatched to Mexico to control the royal income tried to assert authority without acknowledging Cortes. But Cortes wasn't someone who tolerated disrespect from his subordinates. He brushed off their attempts to undercut his authority. The officials, though, sent a report of Cortes's character and his administration to the Spanish court. Their accounts left such an impact that a decision was made to send an inspector to Mexico to look into Cortes's actions, and if his findings called for it, to extradite him to Spain. When the inspector arrived, however, he fell sick and died. Cortes's trouble hadn't yet subsided. The authorities kept relaying negative reports back to Spain, leading to the designation of a fresh committee, vested with ultimate authority, specifically tasked with probing and sanctioning him. Cortes got wind of their intentions. He was irately incensed and felt slighted that the challenging yet pivotal work he'd put in for his native country hadn't been appreciated. His acquaintances advised him, in light of such egregious affront, to respond in kind. Yet he was reluctant to descend to a level that would clash with the devotion and submission he owed his ruler. Eventually, he decided to tolerate the ungrateful, disgraceful treatment over defying his country's legal authority. He determined to journey to Spain and place his fate in the benevolence and fairness of the king. As he presented himself before his leader, all eyes looked on with awe and esteem at the man whose accomplishments seemed to overshadow the great heroes. The humility with which he pleaded his case before the supreme justices dispelled their pre-existing doubts. The king greeted him with high praises and gratitude, bestowing many benefits on him. He awarded him the Order of St. James distinction, promoted him to being a count, and granted him a vast swath of territory in Mexico, which would earn him a considerable income. But when it came to reaffirming him as a governor, it was quite obvious they thought it risky to reinstall him with the authority he potentially could misuse. All he got was an acknowledgement as general and the clearance to forge new paths. The complete dispensation of all civil matters was delegated to a viceroy. Cortes returned to Mexico, but from then on, his life was characterized by an uninterrupted string of difficulties. The viceroy's stringent rules and his diminished authority left him feeling weighed down. His only solace came from discovering and conquering new areas. He organized an exploration on Mexico's west coast, aiming to uncover new lands in the vast South Sea, and was successful in uncovering the Lower California Peninsula. However, upon his return, his life became so unpleasant, he felt compelled to move to Spain and present his grievances directly to the king, appealing to his previous kindness and sense of justice. He did not foresee the even greater hardships that awaited him. In his tumultuous and warlike life, he hadn't learned of the unpredictable nature of court life and the fickleness of the favor of the influential. This was about to become apparent. His reception was lukewarm, his grievances heard with indifference, and his appeals were waved away as unimportant. He had aged, and what significant service could he offer now? His achievements for his king and country were either forgotten or considered appropriately rewarded. In conclusion, much like Columbus, he found himself at the end of his career, facing humiliation from an ungrateful king and his spiteful ministers, and having to plead for fairness. He endured 6 long, miserable years in isolation and abandonment. Ultimately, his sorrow and anger over his treatment was what ended his life. He died on October 11th, 1547, at age 63. His last wish ensured his remains were transported to New Spain, probably because he felt his thankless homeland didn't deserve the honor of being his final resting place. The end. This concludes Cortes, Discovery of Mexico, by Steven Corwall. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for a special free offer.